welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Kimberly King Parsons is the author of Blacklight, a collection of stories that was long-listed for the National Book Award and the Story Prize. In 2020, she received the National Magazine Award for Fiction. Born in Lubbock, Texas, she lives in Portland, Oregon with her partner and children. We Were the Universe is her first novel. Kimberly King Parsons, welcome, and thank you so much for joining today to talk about your brilliant debut novel, We Were the Universe.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
So glad to have you. The New York Times Book Review says We Were the Universe is singular. The ride could not be more rewarding. Parsons' transgressive boldness allows us to feel the soul in places that moderation simply cannot reach. Vanity Fair says it's hilarious, profane, and profound all at once, horny and haunted. Kirkus in a starred review says, filling the eternal trippy desert with love and yearning and laughter, Parsons has created a character so appealing in her cheerful brokenness that you don't want to leave her side for a minute. Author Karen Russell says We Were the Universe is a grief and lust and breast milk saturated psychedelic journey, a story told in the eternal present of an acid trip and the spiraling everyday life of a young Texan mother pushing her daughter's stroller around an unspeakable loss. And author Chelsea Beaker says, sexy, exuberant, hilarious, and deep, We Were the Universe is a page-turning voyage into the churning waters of early motherhood and lurking grief. Kimberly King Parsons spares us not a single line, a single word, and beat by beat creates a cosmic music that soars past our expectations of the form. Honestly, I could go on and on here. This novel is getting so much well-deserved acclaim, but I know listeners want to hear from you, and I am desperate to talk to you about it. So what can you tell us about We Were the Universe? How would you describe it?
So my sort of super shorthand is just to say that it's a novel about Texas motherhood and psychedelics, which usually prompts people to immediately ask me for more information.
Right.
And really, we meet our protagonist, Kit, and she is living a seemingly normal stay-at-home mom life. She's raising a 3, almost 4-year-old, taking her to like gymnastics class and the grocery store. But just under the surface, Kit is dealing with a lot of unresolved pain and guilt surrounding the death of her sister, Julie, which took place while Kit was pregnant, so just before the novel begins. And we meet her, and she has really leapt into this sort of fantasy world because her old coping mechanisms, which included things like maybe some drug use, maybe some, being intimate with strangers, like these things are off the table because now she is in a monogamous relationship. She's essentially sober, and she's not able to sort of use those tools that she was once able to cope. And so grief has caught up with her, and that's where we meet her.
What was the inspiration for this novel? What was the spark that sort of started it all for you?
So I took a trip in 2015 with my dear friend Tom. We were at a writing retreat in Montana, and we went to the Boiling River, which is a gorgeous hot spring. And we were sitting there in the water, and I had left my younger son for the first time, and I was breastfeeding him, and I was feeling all of this. It was gorgeous, beautiful setting, amazing. But I was feeling all of this weird anxiety that like instantly came over me in the water. Meanwhile, my friend Tom had this sort of like blissed out look on his face and seemed like he was having the time of his life. And I was thinking about some things that I had really been putting off because when you have children, they really monopolize not only your present moment, but your inner life in so many ways. And being away from my kids for the first time in a while, was thinking of things in my life that I had been sort of batting away. And so I started to imagine, as I do because I'm a fiction writer, a character who was going through something similar, but who was much closer to the edge than I was, and sort of imagining an extreme version of this character who's coming to the realization that she is kind of unraveling in this beautiful natural setting. And so that's where I started with Kit, was imagining a sort of heightened version of something I was experiencing in real life.
And then how long did it take We Were the Universe to sort of evolve into the form it has now? I think you've said at one point it was like 52 vignettes. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah, so because I do, I come from a background and an appreciation of short fiction primarily. And
Mm,
my first book, Blacklight, was a short story collection. And I feel really comfortable with that form. And for many years, sort of revered it as the ultimate literary form. But
mhm,
then, so when I was, tasked with writing a novel, I think at first I thought, well, maybe it will be more like a linked collection of short stories, or it will be kind of like, you read books like Justin Torres's We the Animals, and it
mhm,
really, in some ways, feels more like a collection of short stories that just have, similar characters, a linked collection. So I
yeah.
thought maybe that was going to be the kind of book that I would write. So initially, I wrote these vignettes, which they are all still here in the book. They really are the heart and core of the book, and they all made it in. But they were just sort of these disparate vignettes that weren't really communicating with each other. They took place in the
Mhm.
past and the present. It was about Kit and Julie, and it was their life as children and in a band, and then Kit's life as an adult without her sister. But I sent this to my agent, and she was like, "This is a really great start." And I was like, "Oh wait, it's not a novel." Um, and and then I sort of put it in a drawer for a really long time. And during that time, I reread some of my favorite novels. And so I read like Mary Gaitskill's Veronica and Joy Williams' State of Grace, and Merritt Tierce's Love Me Back, and sort of started to think about the ways that their compression and precision at the language level was still working in these novels, but they
Mm,
felt like novels, though. They felt very of a piece, and they had longer scenes, and all the scenes were communicating with each other. And then when I went back and pulled it out of the drawer, I was able to sort of write what ultimately ended up being a very traditional, 90,000 word, essentially a 3-act structure novel, although
mhm.
there is this psychedelic trip right in the middle. Pretty normal, pretty typical novel structure. So yeah, that's kind of how that evolved.
But the way that you structurally deal with flashback
Yeah.
is really remarkable. You kind of seamlessly wind through this kind of dual timeline between Kit's present and her past with her sister Julie. And the past isn't linear. We're kind of dipping in and out of the past at different points, but I never feel lost
Oh,
as a
good.
reader. So, I mean, all the transitions are just so fluid. How did you do that?
Thank you. Well, I think that this is a thing that could potentially be tricky for certain readers because it does require, even though I have like mapped it all out and I'm like, trust me, you're gonna understand what's going on in a second. It does require careful reading in some places because of the way that Kit experiences time is such that her present moment is often consumed by the past. And so there are
Mhm.
little triggers in her real life. And so she's, hanging out with her daughter at the playground, but then something's going to trigger something for her. And she's really just sort of jerked backwards into the past. And then we deal with a small flashback, and then we come back to the present. And that
Mhm.
that sort of happens throughout the book. And I knew, well, at one point, actually, the past was in present tense as well. And my very sweet, brilliant editor was like, "Hey, maybe that's a little bit confusing. Like, what if we tried doing it with the past in past tense?" And I was like, "Right, okay, that makes sense." And so I liked this idea of how, because for me, the way that grief works is it consumes your present moment, and
Mhm.
I wanted to capture that feeling of that consumption. But just to clarify things for the reader and make it a little bit easier, our present plane is told in the first person present tense, and then our past is told in past tense. But you're right, it does. move around through what I call emotional chronology, not necessarily like we start at the beginning when they're babies, children, and move
Mhm.
forward. We kind of just move around depending on the hot spots that Kit's seeing and interpreting in her present moment. And so, yeah, it's certainly a choice to do it that way and to spend, I would say that the past has not quite as much real estate as the present, but it's certainly a huge part of the story. If you lost the past tense and all those flashbacks, you would lose the story. But
Yeah.
I worked on balancing it and trying to make sure, yeah, that the reader was never lost, even though we might feel at times like, oh, I feel very like this feels claustrophobic to me in many ways. But I wanted that to be the experience of the reader because that's
Yeah.
how grief works. It's that you really don't want to necessarily be launched backwards in time and have to deal with something, but it's there all the time. And the way that the past animates the present is something that I really wanted to explore.
Yeah. The book is about grief
Yeah.
and also so much about motherhood. Kit's
Yeah.
the mother of a 3-year-old. She's dealing with a strained relationship with her own mother, who's dealing with the loss of her other daughter. Um, what made you decide to weave these two themes together, grief and motherhood?
Well, I think that, I am a mom, and so motherhood is right there available for me, and hugely informs the way that I live in the world. But for me, there's nothing like a child to really distract you from your interior issues. Like, I just remember actually before I even had kids, I was in college and I taught in a preschool for 3-year-olds, and I love 3-year-olds. They are just the most. That age is so fascinating because they're not babies, they can speak, they can understand, they can communicate, but the world is still really magical to them at that age. And so that's why I wanted to make Gilda around, 3.
Yeah.
But the thing that I took away in my own life was the way that children do pull you out of yourself in such a way. And so grief is very solipsistic, it's very interior, you're kind of alone with it, and yet you can't be that and be raising a child at the same time. It's almost impossible. And so I liked this idea of having a character who has really been kind of putting her own processing of grief and pain on the back burner while she's dealing with this child, because there's nothing like a newborn to distract you from
Yeah.
yourself. But now Gilda's starting to get a little bit more independence, and she is starting to sort of be able to deal with herself. She's not a baby anymore. And now all of those things that have been in suspension are starting to crumble. And so Kit is now having to deal with it. So for me, there's something about the way that those two things worked together, the grief and the motherhood worked really well. And then also, I love writing young voices, children's voices. I'm always attracted to that, I think, because of that magic. Kids are living in a different world than the world we're living in.
Mhm.
The world is so, and that's what I'm fascinated with, is the sort of the difference of what's underneath or above the everyday. Those are
Yeah.
always the moments that I find so fascinating. So yeah.
Well, I actually had a note here to ask you about Gilda,
Yeah.
3-year-old daughter. She's very present. She has a lot to say. Literally, she has a lot of dialogue, and she's a fully drawn character. And so I was wondering how you were able to render this 3-year-old so perfectly,
Thank
because it feels
you.
like that's really hard to do.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's easy. I think writing young children you can tip into precocity really easily. And,
Mhm.
a lot of times I think people make the mistake of putting adult language into children's mouths. And so a child would
Mhm.
be like, why is Trump so bad or something,
Yeah.
it's like, but a child is saying it. And you're like, well, I don't actually think that seems more like the parent's voice coming through the child. So it's
Mhm.
tricky. But I have two children who live with me who are mine, and I definitely keep notes. I keep track of things that they said. I think of Gilda as both a sort of synthesized conglomerate of both of my sons, but also she's her own person too, and maybe even some of those preschool kids. I've always been really attuned to the way that little kids see the world and the things that they say, and so I have this, on my phone, just notes, and I've just collected all these little snippets from either things that my kids have said or their friends or, family members, nieces and nephews, just because they are just a wealth of information. And
Yeah.
so I've always been sort of into that. So Gilda came from that, but I think also really just from the experience of parenting my own kids in many ways.
Well, also how you handle mothering um, in the novel is really great. And this idea, specifically, I loved of performative parenting. I think it's like in the first scene in the novel when
Yeah,
you're Kit's at the playground and she's telling Gilda things out loud, but she doesn't
yeah,
really care what Gilda does. She's just realizes she's saying it out loud so that the other parents can
yeah.
hear. And that just felt so right on to me. I was like, oh yeah, I didn't even really realize, I guess, that I did that, but I do that. Um, so are you filing away, in addition to what children are saying, also sort of these like feelings and little moments? How does that work for you? Are you sort of hunting and gathering?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I noticed that what Kit calls the theater of parenthood,
Yes.
definitely being at play. Just, I think my friends who have dogs say the same thing about the dog park, that
It's
when you're
true.
in an environment with other people, and really the only thing you have in common is you're caretaking for this child or this animal, and so you're in this space together, and you might not actually have anything in common, but you're seeing each other every day in this weird
Mhm.
way, and you do start to form relationships. But she's a young mom, but even I was not a young mom. I had my kids in my 30s, but I
Mhm.
still felt that feeling that I think most parents feel, which is
Yeah.
like, am I doing this right? Like,
Mhm.
am I doing an okay job? Like, there's just so many ways you can, and also people have so many strong opinions about how to parent, especially people without children, surprisingly. But so I definitely
Yes.
remembered those feelings and that sort of the anxiety of like, oh no, my daughter in the book, she's like, my daughter doesn't have her shoes on. People are going to judge me because you can't have a kid barefoot on the playground, even though it's like I can put her shoes on her 100 times and she's going to take them off, but I have to say something out loud. Or, people will just walk up to you and tell you, put a hat on that baby, like your baby's freezing. And you're like, they're fine. Like, but just that sense of always being sort of judged and sort of watched. And so she's performatively doing things like, yeah, remember, Gilda, we're kind. We're always kind to others. Like she's saying that also as just a way to sort of cover herself so that people know I'm paying attention. I'm aware of the situation. There's just all these really weird, subtle dynamics that happen. And Kit, being a young mother, is also trying to figure out where she fits into the hierarchy of this neighborhood. And so
Oh,
that becomes important as well.
yeah. There's also just a beautiful juxtaposition, if I can say the word, um, in how different characters deal with grief, how they deal with
Mhm.
life in general, really. The difference between holding on and letting go. Can you
Yeah.
speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, so, Kit believes that she's really fooled everyone and that no one knows that inside she's sort of spiraling. But of course, the people who love her most do know. And her husband and her best friend, Pete, it turns out they know much more than she gives them credit for knowing. But she is keeping all of this stuff inside, even though she is doing the right steps. She's going to therapy, she's trying to move through these, the motions of a grieving person. But she's sort of stunted in her processing of this. Meanwhile, her mother is has now become a hoarder. Her mother's always had sort of tendencies to gather things, but in the wake of the loss of Julie, her mom has started just accumulating things, and it's not just Julie's things, it's just all kinds of stuff. And so her pain is literally out in the open where everyone can see. And Kit talks a little bit about the difference between shame and humiliation. Shame is inside, where
Mhm.
it has its way with you, but humiliation is outside where everyone can see it. And so I think, Kit believes that the way that her mother is processing grief is not great. Like she sort of sees that as opposed to her way, which is like, we should just keep it inside. And her mother is, it's all out there for everyone to see. And of course, the two of them have a very complicated relationship anyway. But they are processing grief in really different ways.
We've been talking about filing away experiences.
Mhm.
There are also a lot of psychedelics in this novel.
Yeah,
I'll have to ask, how did you conduct
sure.
your research?
Sure. Hands-on research. Yeah, no, I have had a number of really positive formative experiences with psychedelics as a young person. like Kit, these are things that have happened more than a dozen years ago because actually longer than that, because I have kids now and doesn't really fit into my life. But as a sort of more experimental teenager and young adult, I found psychedelics to be very positive, to have a really positive, formative impact on my life. And so, in Texas, where I grew up, you could access mushrooms very easily, just
Mhm.
on a cow pasture. This was something that, when there's not a lot to do, this is something that becomes an event and an activity. But then, yeah, I think that I took a lot of really a positive sense of well-being. I feel that the use of psychedelics has changed the way that I think for the better. I don't know, I was so young, it's hard to say. Maybe I would have come to these things on my own, but the way that I view art and music, I can see the parts in a different way, and I'm really aware of the way the pieces click together. Whereas before, I didn't really notice that. But again, I was young. Maybe I would have come to these things on my own. But I also just feel that for me, psychedelics can have the power to take an event and transform it in your interior space. And so
Mhm.
they're not for everyone. This is certain. But
Mhm.
for me, I felt like I had sort of essentially accomplished like years of therapy just through a focused trip. And I also believe that, you have the trip you're supposed to have. And so, sometimes it would be, oh, I don't want to think about, let's say, my parents' divorce or something. And then, of course, that's
Mhm.
what you're going to think about. You're going to think about
Mhm.
that for 12 hours. And
Mhm.
then, you come out of it with perspective. And so for me, I used to think of psychedelic trips as just this tool to access a certain part of myself. And that sense of well-being or being cared for, that has persisted my whole life. And this, to sort of the cliche of like, we're all connected and we're all cosmically joined. I believe it. I believe it. I feel it. That feeling persisted even years. It's been years and years since I've done those things, but I still feel the positive effects.
And when did the choice come that that would be a big part of the novel and the mechanics and the way that it works?
Yeah. So, okay, when I sold Blacklight, I was a two-book deal, and they said, you have to have like, what are you going to write a novel about? You need to write a novel. And I said, well, I don't have a novel. And I asked my agent, like, what do we say? And she's like, no, we say we're going to write a novel and you'll just figure it out. But they needed me to tell them what the subject would be of the novel. And so I said, okay, well, these are things I know about. Like, I know about Texas, which is where I'm from, and 5 generations going back. I know about motherhood because I just had my kids, and I know about psychedelics. Like, these are things I know about, and I wanted to try to figure out how to make a character in a scenario where I could use this sort of specific, strange collection of knowledge, and put it all together in the form of a voice and a character.
I love that. Let's talk about tone for a second.
Sure.
We heard Karen Russell in her blurb earlier called this novel a tonal masterpiece. And the way Kit experiences and describes the world is equally hilarious and devastating. How are you able to strike that balance with her?
So I'm always thinking about, I value humor in my real life. I really gravitate towards people who are funny, and you have to be focused and paying attention on the present moment in order to be funny. It's key that you're like clicked in and tuned into the present. And so
Mhm.
this becomes really important. So this is important to me. It's how I want to live my life. You're not noticing, a weird thing someone says or something interesting if you're not really like sinking into the present. And so that's like, this is just how I want to live my life. My kids are hilarious. Like, I gravitate towards people who are really funny. But I knew also that, I mean, humor is a huge coping mechanism. And I really quickly can synthesize something that's very bad and make it funny quickly, because I know that this is how part of the way that I process negativity is to make it a story, to put some sort of a narrative frame around it. And so I
Mhm.
think that's also what I do with humor. So really quickly, something that's, upsetting can be made funny, and then I can own it and hold it in a different way. And I have control over it. It's mine now. And it's my bit. Now it's funny. Now it's a thing I can tell other people. It's not shameful because it's not internal anymore. And so I wanted to try to write a character who could do that as well. And so even though it is, of course, about this really sad circumstance, she's so funny. And the way that she's
Mhm.
um the things that she's noticing and relating, and she's a little bit mean sometimes with her judgments of people around her, but also because she feels so incredibly judged, and she's
Oh.
just constantly turning things around in that way. And one example of a book that I think that does this so well is Miriam Tave's All My Puny Sorrows, which is about two sisters, and one sister wants to end her life. And it's a devastating book in so many ways, but the lightness and the energy and the exuberance that Taves uses to express this transcendent connection between these two sisters is so beautifully rendered. And I was just trying to think about how can you modulate, with the tone, how can you
Mhm.
move between humor and devastation, and how can you
Yeah.
sort of, be agile enough to do it quickly. So yeah, that was the goal. But I'm glad it worked for you.
Goal accomplished.
Great.
You've said that one thing that you love is when the main character believes that they're the shittiest character in the book. What do
Yes.
you mean by that?
I love that so much because I think that when we write characters as the author, we have the ability to make this sort of straw man scenario. We could make a hero and everyone around them could suck and everyone around them could be terrible and they could be victimized constantly. And what happens then is everyone is flattened out because now we see the author pulling the little puppet strings and it's not interesting to me. And so what I want, even though we could know from the outside, well, Kit's actually not that bad. She's trying. She's doing her best. Kit
Mhm.
believes she's the worst. She believes she's the absolute worst person in the story, which gives her a vantage point from which to observe other people as well. And that's why, even if she's talking shit about this other mom in the park, she can, but deep down we know, well, Kit also believes she's much worse than Nancy, this annoying mom. Like Kit's like,
Mhm.
I'm the worst person here, but Nancy's the second worst person here, maybe, but I
Mhm.
love that sort of playing around with that dynamic. And also just this sense of really writing into shame. Like the way that I know I'm on the right track with something is when I start to feel like, oh, wow, this character is being very vulnerable right now. Like they're really showing this thing that is making them not look great. That's
Mhm.
how I know I'm on the right path because to me,
Yeah.
that's what makes really full, well-rounded characters are characters who are willing to show the part of themselves that are, it's not always great. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I feel about that.
Great. We go back to the same places, a lot of the same places over and over
Mhm.
within the novel, and watching how Kit experiences them differently each time. And you've said that you're playing with economy of place here, economy of setting. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. This idea. So the way that I write sentences is using this method called consecution, which is pulling a sound or some sort of piece of syntax from one sentence and pulling it through the rest. And so if you think of it, it's like putting beads on a necklace, sort of. And so
Mhm.
that's what's happening at the sentence level. But then you can also do that at the structural level as well. So that means taking a scene, like let's say this park bench, which is where we meet Kit at the
Mhm.
beginning of the book. We
Mhm.
return to it many times, and it works in two ways. One is it creates a neighborhood, right? Instead of her being, she could be in 5 different places or 10 different places, and we're not going to start to get the sense of this place where she is and what that neighborhood is like because it's almost like now she's somewhere else and now she's somewhere else and now she's
Yeah.
but every time we return to that park bench, there's an accumulation of the description. It's already been described once, and now I can add a couple little things to it, and we're getting this sense of a rich space, right? But
Mhm.
you can do that also with characters as well. So I think that sometimes in novels, people will just, it's almost like they want to show you 100 things. Like I can show you 100 characters in 100 places. And for me, it starts to feel like you're running across a bridge and the bridge is falling off behind you. And what
Yeah.
I want to feel is this supported atmosphere of like, I know where I am and I know these people. And also when Kit returns to that park bench later in the book, she's changed. The park bench is the same, but Kit is
Mhm.
changed. And that's how I feel it works to sort of you take these pieces that are sort of modular and you move them around. And so, she goes to the same coffee shop. The coffee shop turns into a bar at night. I used to live above a place like this in New York. At night, it was a bar. In the daytime, it was a coffee shop. But she's returning to the same place, but she's changing. And so that's how we can start to modulate the sense of her character developing or growing or changing over time. So the settings stay the same, the characters change. And then also, I think there's ways that you can mirror characters in different ways as well. So it's like, the way that Kit's processing grief is one way and the way her mom's processing it is another way. But if you really lined them up, you could see, wow, these are sort of just direct mirrors of each other.
Mhm.
And I love playing with that. I teach a class and I call it portals and mirrors. So portals being, how can I connect these places or these scenes together? And mirrors being, what are the things that need to be reflected in different places in the book?
Oh, wow,
Without
that's
being too
great.
technical. I know that sounds very like, but
No, I love the technical. That's
okay, good.
fantastic. Yeah, no, that's brilliant. That's great. Now I want to take the class. Um,
Yeah.
what is your process like? I guess daily writing routine being one part of that, but also, sort of overall, when you get that first idea for, you obviously worked a lot in short stories and, how does that come to fruition eventually?
So this one was weird because it was the pandemic and it was my kids were home. I don't know how I did
Oh.
it. Honestly, I'm like, how did it happen? I don't know. I don't know. But I have now that things are back to normal, a schedule where I try to touch the work every day for 1 hour. And that's all I have to do is look at it for 1 hour. And then usually it's things are going well enough that I can continue with that. But if they're bad, then you can stop and move on with your life. And to me, it's really important to not view art making as like a slog or a grind that I have to get through. I want to touch it every day and see it, but if sometimes you open the document and it's garbage and you're like, I'm not feeling it today. I've never been able to sort of fight my way through. I feel much better about acknowledging the fact that today is not going to be a good writing day, closing the document, going outside, seeing a movie, meeting a friend, doing something totally different so that I can maintain a level of enthusiasm for the project. Because
Mm, mhm.
enthusiasm is how you get through everything. Without enthusiasm, you have nothing because
Yeah.
nobody is there with you with the project. It's just you. And so if you start to hate the project, it's a very bad thing. So I try to do that every day. But mostly what the main thing I need to do every day is to be reading something else closely and carefully, other novels, other books, other stories, books on craft, whatever it is. I have
Mhm.
to be reading. So I definitely make more time for reading than writing every day. And if something, I know that things are like very bad in my life if I'm not able to read because I can't write if I'm not reading and I can't access that part of my brain. To me, it's like this glorious meditative state, really deeply reading other people's work. So I always make time for that. Sometimes the writing is like, nope, it's not going to happen, but the reading will always happen unless things are
Mhm.
very backwards for some reason, or like I have a kid homesick or something like that. But yeah, I try to do it that way. And I also try to give myself the grace to put something away because time has never hurt a work. And like nobody's
Yeah.
ever been like, oh, I took way too much time on that. I mean, there's a feeling, a sensation of like, we have to produce, we have to hurry up. And
Yeah.
I am really resistant to that feeling. That feeling lets me know that I'm on the wrong path. The feeling of like, hurry up, hurry up. That
Mhm.
is a cue to slow down, in fact. And so when I start to feel that, or I start to get moved by the marketplace and, whatever, I'm like, oh, I have to hurry up and write the next book. This would be a great time to sell a book. It's like,
Yeah.
well, you have to just let the work come out on its own. And I feel like if I have a superpower, it's patience. And it's like that's the thing I try to cultivate in everything that I do is just to be able to sit with my thoughts and to be able to like know that the work is going to come to me the way that it's supposed to come, which is not easy. And sometimes it's very hard, but I try.
Have you always been a writer?
Yeah, yeah, I have. I've always been a reader, for
Mm.
sure.
Mhm.
And I've always been, and as a child, I was a liar. And I lied about a lot of things to a lot of people. Um, I was an only child for many years, and then I had siblings later in life. But when I was an only child, I told all kinds of stories about how I had a robot at home. I don't know. I just had a lot of lies that I told other kids, but also other people's parents. Like, I don't know. I had a very vivid imagination
Mhm.
and a lot of confidence to tell these things. And then I was always reading, even though I grew up in a house without books, like we didn't have books in our house. But once I got a library card and there was this, and obviously the grocery store has all the paperbacks, but
Yeah.
even there was like a used bookstore I could walk to when I was growing up. And I was reading like all kinds of things I should not have been reading at a very young age. I was reading Stephen King when I was like 8, 9 years old, not getting a lot of it, but just really loving it.
Yeah.
I was reading like smutty romance books when I was very young, but I just loved being immersed in story always. And
Yeah.
then also, when you're a kid, you do a lot of play. Like my friend who lived across the street, we would play Lost on an Island, and we would have these like very detailed scenarios that almost like our own soap opera that we would like pick up with every time we played. And you have to keep track of all the characters in your mind. And I don't know, I feel like all of those things were I was writing even if I wasn't writing back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what was the road to publication like for you?
Yeah. So again, I guess because I didn't feel super rushed to get this out. I went to Columbia, and a lot of my friends, Karen Russell, I didn't know her back then, but she was a year ahead of me, and she had a book out when she was so young, and it was
Yeah.
met to wild acclaim. And a lot of people had their books out in their 20s, and I just had this weird stubborn resolve that I wasn't ready yet. I wasn't
Mhm.
quite ready to send it into the world. I also knew biologically that I wanted to have kids. And so I was like, well, that clock is ticking in a different way than the novel clock.
Yeah.
So I had my children. I had the stories for Blacklight. Some of them started back in 2005, but it wasn't until 2019 that the book came out. So like a big gap in between. And in that
Mhm.
time I had kids. And I just, I met my agent at a writing workshop, and we immediately signed. And then that was in July, and we sold the 2 books in September, which is crazy, but it seems
Wow.
fast. But it was like, well, yeah, but also there was like a dozen years before it got there. So the whole idea of like an overnight success that took me like a dozen years, honestly, to really get the book in the right shape. And I turned in a version of the book for my thesis of Blacklight in 2010, and it was just a much worse version of Blacklight, like a much worse
Mhm.
version. So I'm so glad that I continued and like took the time to really get them as close to the version that was in my head. And of course, nothing's ever exactly, nothing really meets the version that's in your head, but you just try to get as close as you can. So yeah.
What do you know now that you would have liked to have known then before you published Blacklight?
I think even though I had this weird stubborn sense of it will happen eventually,
Mhm.
I wish that I could have not felt anxious or anxiety about this process. Like if I had just known, like, hey, you're going to be almost 40 when your first book comes out, and it's going to be totally fine. And then you're going to write another book and it's going to be great. Like I wish that I could have had that the confidence that I was projecting. I wish that I had felt it a little bit more interior, because
Yeah.
it would have saved me a lot of anxiety, I think, just to know like everything's going to work out. Also, there's just so many people in the writing world who, there is a lot of anxiety about the process, and people will tell you like short stories don't sell, or like you're never going to make money, or it's publishing is such a mess, or whatever. And I've always been pretty good about like, well, that's not going to be the case for me, like for whatever reason, or just like sort of believing in the process for some reason. And I think if I could go back, I would have just been like, yeah, just stay the course and don't worry. But I tried to do it as much as I could, but just to have the full confidence that like nothing that is meant for you will miss you, and nothing that's not yours will come to you. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's great. And what's your best advice? You teach as well. What's your best advice for early career writers?
So I think the biggest thing is I want to try to help writers come to their within a project, the authentic voice of that project. And so what that means is not them writing towards what they think people want to read or the marketplace or whatever. Because again, like if I had told people years ago, I'm going to write a book about Texas motherhood and LSD or psychedelics, they would have been like, okay, like that's very strange. Like you have your own unique experiences. Like everyone has their version of Texas motherhood and psychedelics. It's something that lives in
Mhm.
them. It's these things that they know about that have friction between each other, that are endlessly entertaining to you personally. It's figuring out what your subject matter is and figuring out your project, and then um, developing an authentic voice to accompany it. And so in my case, because I write fiction, it's always character driven, and it's always paying attention and listening to the syntax of a narrator, which tells me their class, it tells me their outlook on life, it tells me their personality, like just those syntactical choices. And every project is going to be different, but just really focusing on what the story that only you can tell, because there is a story that you're the only one in the whole world who could ever tell it because of your precise DNA and your precise experience and all of your enthusiasms and your obsessions. They will come out, but you have to pay attention, and you can't let the marketplace or some idea of what you think you should be writing dictate the work itself. Yeah.
Wonderful advice. Traditional last question
Sure.
on this podcast. When We Were the Universe is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh my God. So, okay, Of Montreal is the epigraph for the book. It's a line from the song The Past is a Grotesque Animal, which says, no matter where we are, we're always touching by underground wires. And that song is like this really drony. I don't think that song is the best theme song, but I think there's another song that's by Of Montreal that Kit references in the first chapter, first part of the book. Where Kevin Barnes, the singer, he's the line is like, "Come on, chemicals," and he's trying to get his brain to, be bathed in the feel-good chemicals that he needs in that moment. So I feel like that song would be the ultimate theme song, and it's a very catchy, fun, happy song about being desperately sad. So I love the combination of those two things together, and I think it would be one of those like snappy opening things, but then you would listen to the lyrics and be like, "Wow, this is actually very, very dark." So yeah, I think that would be it.
Oh, yeah, that'd be perfect. Kimberly King Parsons, thank you so much for joining. It has really been a joy to get to talk with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all you do for readers and writers. It's much appreciated.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.